Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. My name is Annika, and I'm your host. In today's episode, as I kind of prefaced in the last one, we are going to be having a deeper discussion this time on the Malleus Maleficarum, focusing more specifically the start of the witch archetype that was created by the clergy and inquisitors in the early modern period. Really, how did this shape the same fear that we see and we feel today? So, I really don't want to repeat too much of what I said last time. So, I am going to focus on its main impression on the modern day and the impact on witches in today's terms. But if you want a little bit more of a deep dive on the actual history, publication date, how it started, when, really all that kind of stuff, please look at my first episode. So let's look at a bit of a content overview of the Malleus. So we definitely know that the Malleus spread incredibly fast after its publication. In its time, the printing press was actually a new invention, and well, everyone was eager to make a good use of it and make money off of it. So, what's a better way than to get hot, fresh copies of the revolutionary witch hunting Bible in every place possible across Europe? So, in the Malleus, there are three main sections. The first instructs the detection of the witch and, well, the very real threat of them existing in the first place. Part one of the Malleus will kind of get everyone on board about how scary and threatening this really is. It's that scary story a child is told to keep out of the candy jar, but it's for everyone, no matter their age. And this wasn't about getting cavities or a bellyache. It was about your soul in eternal damnation. What could be worse? Well, by the time you finished reading the first section, you would come to understand that not even believing in witches or demonology is also heresy, and it's punishable. So no one was safe. You couldn't even read this thing and by the end of it say, well, I'm just not even going to believe in that because that's just as bad. This is where that I think the spark really was lit. That feeling of fear, and that's what got the ball rolling, I think, even today. As someone who has been in church services many, many times, I can share, well, my experience and my experience only, but there's something about being in this collective space where a man is standing at the front reading a book with this boom in his voice, repeating the words of God, how this evil, this truest of evils exists, and it's tempting us at all moments. It's the epitome of fear mongering, and I think most of us can understand that, especially if you're a witch, which I hope you are listening to this podcast. And I'd love to say, while they only speak of love and miracles of God, and that's just not really what sticks for most people. Yes, you can get those sermons talking about, the miracles, but you have to be a good worshiper. You have to stay away from that constant threat of evil. If good things don't happen to you, that's because you're just not being a good enough child of God. It's like running on a treadmill and behind you is a pool of lava and in front of you is your wildest dreams. You're just going to be constantly running in place. Everyone turned against each other, and the church continued to rise to power, rise to the ultimate sensation of this control. The parts of you that are authentic, rebellious, genuinely fun in your desires are purely frowned upon. So, after being scared shitless about what will happen to your soul if you don't try to detect witches on the constant and play your little part in the great war of good and evil, then part two will entertain the very feeling of being scared shitless. It would go into great detail on the activities of these witches. Why were they so scary? Why do we need to execute them? You might be asking yourself if you're someone reading this at the time. Well, sexual deviance. It was a huge part of it, which I don't know, I think really it does translate even today when it comes to just the pure taboo of sex. But this is what foreshadows this deep-rooted misogyny that has become really an undeniable part of this subject and part of history. Women were already looked at as less than and simply weaker. That was just a fact that was stated in the Bible. They are more susceptible to the temptations of earthly sins. Their bodies were looked at as pure temptation. It was the embodiment of temptation. It taunted men every single day. It really wasn't seen as the man's fault for looking. It was the woman's natural allure that tried to yank him down off of the righteousness pedestal, per se. While being a sexual temptation was, well, bad from the start, then imagine having sex with the devil himself. Incubi, succubi, even transvection, better known as night riding or flight, and also shapeshifting. These are things that really introduced these are the evil things that, these witches are doing under the cloak of nighttime. It was told that these witches would meet at a Sabbath by flight. We all know the fly to the witch's Sabbath, copulating with the devil and sealing the transaction with a kiss to his anus. Yes, a kiss to the devil's asshole would make you the real deal. So let's just imagine this for a minute. You see, old lady comes down the road, home late from tending to her crops, and closes the door behind her. Seconds after, her feline friend, who's really good at catching all the rats, hops out the window for a night hunt. But now suddenly it's not really what it looks like. That witch just transformed and is now leaving to go have relations with the devil and even other witches in the woods. Boom. You're gonna get tried, you're gonna get executed. When in reality, she probably was just a little bit of an outlier. There really is one repeating topic in the Malleus that sticks with me, and even in the fears among witches today, and that is the sexual deviance. There's this funny way of all of the most outrageous taboos, accurate or not, that make their way into the film industry, social media, books, and still churches today that keep that flame lit. Of all the things, the subject of sex with demons and false gods, communicating with spirits, blood magic, which is a whole other subject I would love to shed light on at some point. But point is, these are the things that make witchcraft look so scary. These are the things that are the most profitable. Profitable monetary wise, for those wanting to keep others afraid mostly. I personally have had experiences even a few months ago where, I'm accused of the most horrendous things just because it's been out that, oh, she's a witch. Or if the subject of magic of witchcraft comes up at a social gathering, which is not really rare today considering the impression it has on social media in recent times, and it really has blown up in the past, that even crude jokes pertaining to these so-called scary topics still come up. It's not rare. You could be at a bar having a drink and it simply comes up innocently and some stranger say, "Oh, well, you have sex with the devil," or you do all this crazy stuff, or what do you do, curse people? It's always to the worst. You know, whether it's with the conscious mind purposefully putting that at the forefront or not, it still has an impact. You don't have to be a part of that fear. Obviously, you do what's most comfortable. And as magical practitioners, I believe that we are ever changing and growing, which is completely okay. And I think it's a good thing that we don't shut certain things out from our magical practice and potential due to this fear. That's sort of a different angle. If you're someone who is growing and you're thinking, oh, maybe working with blood as an offering is something I'm interested in, just, you know, that is a good thing. If you go about it the right way, you're doing your research, you look into the traditions, and you are consciously respecting the way you move forward, then that is where real growth happens. But if you just say, no, I don't want to be associated with that fear, I don't want to be associated with that sort of thing, that's just pure ignorance and negligence on your end, in my opinion, that you are also becoming a part of that problem, even though you're within the witchcraft community. So even this idea of practicing good magic. Let's talk about that. This love, this light, this new age bullshit. And yeah, I'm gonna hate on that. That was something that existed too for a while, or at least it was spoken of in the Malleus, and it was still declared heretical and illegal. Magic is magic, a sin is a sin. There has been this strive for God's acceptance, even as a local healer in the 16th century would be. She was not safe behind her Good Samaritan streak of curing ailments and tonics. One with such knowledge of these herbs and plants must come from Satan himself, right? Especially if she were a woman. How else could she have access to this knowledge? If you're using herbal remedies in place of praying to God to save your child's fever, that was heresy, a sin, an invitation for damnation. It was, I think, if anyone's seen the show Outlander, I forget which season it is, but it's the season with all the witch trials in it. And there is a moment where, a kid is poisoned for eating lily of the valley because it looks like wood garlic, and she has this knowledge of just the plant material in their area, and she offers her help, and everyone is so scared. It really is just this like anti-poison that she's trying to give this child to lower the toxicity levels, but it was in that time, no, he was possessed. He was possessed by the devil. He was possessed by demons, and you know, the the pastor came out and did an exorcism and then even called her a witch for having this knowledge, and that was not unheard of for that time. And even though that's kind of a silly example because that's TV, I think it's still an accurate representation of how the fear translates. So, also in this section of the Malleus, it was said that, witches who can injure but cure are in a pact with the devil. Witches who can cure and not injure are also in pact with the devil. But somehow it's just a stranger pact. Really key word for it. Even if you're doing good, there's still evil and you need to die. And then there are those who can cure and injure, which was believed to be a little bit of unheard of because back then, today, but especially back then, people loved to shove you in you're good or you're evil. You can't be both. So now you have to hide your babies too, because it was warned that witches steal them to devour them, offer them to the devil. We all know, the ancient recipe for flying ointment contains baby fat. These are all things, again, put in place to turn one against another. So even if if your child was baptized, then that was really the only safe way to keep your child away from these so-called witches. And we can really go on and on about all these hysterical accounts, quote, of witch activity. But to get to the point, there were so many ways for the public and inquisitors to, quote, detect these, quote, witches. Even midwives who helped another woman through childbirth would be sent to trial if the child did not survive, which was extremely common throughout the 16th and 17th century. It was made fact that these women were instructed by the devil to harm as many children as possible, and literally warned the reader about this exact scenario in the Malleus. There's a section where it explains how if a woman is going through childbirth and the midwife is there to help and the child does not make it, then she is tried as a witch. So then the suspected witch would be forced to confess through torture. Brutal ways to extract exactly what the clergy wanted, and on top of it, to make an example of how the church really was just so concerned about your soul. So even the innocent, which, well, most of these were, um, you're going to be killed for your crimes no matter the outcome of the trial, torture, or questioning. I stress this because the witch as a whole has been burned by religion, by patriarchy, by society, and by related families. For hundreds of years, this fear has not just disappeared, Even if you are among the fortunate who discover this path of witchcraft and come out with ease, many of you may still feel the sense of isolation or judgment. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but even families of the most accepting tend to be adverse to the very subject of witchcraft. Now, in the modern era, we can understand most of it is due to a lack of knowledge and what it really means to practice magic, or maybe you have been affected in some way by the satanic panic. Even some witches can feel like they are scared to come out of the broom closet in the first place due to their own teeny tiny fear of what they are, even when they have nothing to be afraid of and when it comes to being accepted by loved ones. This is a collective shadow, a collective wound, whether you have religious trauma or not. That's what I believe. However, you identify personally, this witch wound we all share on some level. It's not gender exclusive, or maybe we don't all share this wound, but many of us may identify with it. In any capacity, it is still valid. I feel like this really isn't talked about much. I think I see, a lot of practitioners where it may feel kind of weird or taboo to talk about Abrahamic faiths or Christianity in a more comfortable way because maybe we've just had some pretty uncomfortable experiences with it at some point or another. I want to just plug here because I think if I don't, most people will come for me, but I want to make a distinction here. I know many practices and traditions can incorporate and or share religious beliefs with backgrounds with religious based magic, and if you do, that's completely fine. You do you. You know, that is not what we're talking about here. So there's definitely a team of people who nonstop shit on religion, and I've seen it in the community. I've seen it in person. Maybe even attack those who have a certain faith, which is truly unfortunate since I think you're missing a pretty big point of witchcraft. Our goal here is to grow and to become better ultimately, right? But, luckily, I also see quite the opposite. Many of us grow from this little pot of soil that maybe hurt to break through and accept the path of the witch. Also, accept those who identify with these religions with wide open arms. Personally, I still have many loved ones and friends that have completely different faiths than me. And that part of me that accepts them for who they are, I really can't attribute it to I look back inside myself and I feel like I'm being a better witch for growing past that wound. We can step above what has hurt us before and choose to accept it for what it is, whether for a loved one or, you know, who may be a believer or for ourselves. In my personal experience, it was the latter. I hated talking about it, thinking about it, having anything to do with it. It made me extremely uncomfortable, and I could physically feel myself shutting down anytime it was brought up in conversation. Or I just purely wanted to shit on it, you know? But as I started to evolve and I started to feel like I wasn't really being a good witch or even authentic by keeping it behind that locked door of hatred, that was a wound and that was a shadow, basically telling it to shut up when it entered into my life at any given point. I had to face it and accept it. I did not need to follow it and to get to my goal of being in my truth as a witch, and I definitely didn't need to hate the fuck out of someone else's path either. Christianity burned me to a degree, but I chose not to burn it back for my own sake. My goal here really is to help others turn inwards, dissect these parts of themselves, and get your own conversation going, because in the end, it only empowers you and your magic further. So I really want to kind of go back to what shapes this fear of the woman as a witch. And we can't ignore that the violence was not inflicted on men as well. During this time, however, there are certainly accounts of men being tried and executed as well. And interestingly, in places like Finland, I think nearly 80% of those executed for witchcraft were biological men. If there is one thing I think we should all understand before discussing the horror of these trials, is that witchcraft accusations are sex related, not sex specific. And, it gets even we could talk about the horrors and the hate crimes even today when it comes to however you identify. Um, However, we just can't bypass the obvious. So it's just plain and simple fact that when we're talking about history and how the witch has come to be what it is today, this long journey, that the image is simply made in a sort of spectacle of misogyny. You know, this was one of the main firing pistons behind these trials. The archetype of the witch created by this text was arguably designed specifically to target those who exhibited this personal sovereignty, most of them being women, those who really defied the patriarchal norms of this time. Really, if you went against the grain in any sort of way, spoke too loud, stubborn, too knowledgeable, literate, anything but a compliant homemaker who could bear children and obey quietly was a threat. So the Malleus continued to argue that this threat was held by women. It was a legal document supported by the church. I think it is certainly arguable that the target on the woman's back for witchcraft was inevitable, with the Bible and religious structuring deliberately defined women as the lesser sex. They were inherently weak, and that made them inherently more susceptible to the likes of sins like witchcraft, magic, and false prophecies. For, a little bit of context and going back to the Bible, Corinthians 11:8-9 was said, "For a man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man." There was no escaping this as a woman. There was no way to argue that you were not tempted, that you were not the temptation itself, because the Bible simply ruled it so. Adam was not the one who deceived, but the woman did. Eve did. Timothy 2:13, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became the transgressor." So there we go. It happened, it already happened once. And in this everyday war between good and evil, God and Satan, there lies the ultimate Judas. Probably your wife crocheting a new blanket or something, while you have been brainwashed to think she is working conjuring, cursing everyone left and right. Honestly, if that were me in that situation, I might take that offer and work a few little witch knots in there. But, there's this idea of really destroying the sovereign individual. If you wielded any sort of influence in the community or lived independently, you bet you're on that list of suspects for witchcraft. And at that point, it didn't matter however the fuck you identified. If you were anything but perfect in the eyes of of the church, the witch hunts were on, and you can be seen as an effort, to eliminate any alternative sources of knowledge of power that challenged the church's hegemony. That's what the hunts were for, especially those rooted in pre-Christian, pagan, or folk traditions. It was a crusade to destroy these traditions. Even most of those old enough to have been in place before Christian influence and survive would have been tainted. Traditions changed, morphed, and evolved just to survive. That's why today, we see a lot of influence and parallels even in old traditional witchcraft today. It has a religious counterpart, and they have to exist together because that is how history has made it. Many people don't like to think of that or believe it, but I think honestly we've got to be kidding ourselves and not doing ourselves as much justice as we should as witches if we want to think that that really isn't true. Yes, there are old traditions, but it all has been changed in some way. Many practices, like neo-paganism, can even recognize it as a reconstruction of the old beliefs and traditions before the Christian influence. I think it's important to recognize this sort of weird symbiotic relationship, or, better to say, these correlations of the witch and witchcraft with that of the church and or Abrahamic faiths, Catholicism, Christianity. These are the ones that have really, truthfully, been able to preserve some parts of witchcraft and magic. because witches really couldn't. By nature, the witch is wild, you know. The point of it is to swim up the stream of the rules and regulations, per se, of the church and society. We want to take the control into our own hands. We see something in our lives that we don't want, and, through mundane and magical efforts, we change that. We put that energy into the universe and we watch it work itself, and we see those changes reflect back on us. It's this constant play of cause and effect, and we're the ones who are dealing the cards. So if we really go back and talk about this idea, or this fact really, that duality exists in an organized religion, while it's true that they too have their adversary, the witch falls under that structure, not just the devil or Satan. These religions, in a way, need the proof that the father of all evil exists and is thriving within, well, so-called father of evil, exists within these so-called witches to back their story. We have to be the proof to keep everyone else going into church on Sunday. Whether this is not, the proof of its innate harm, but in the past, also, in the modern age, to this day, there is this war on witches and on alternative spiritualities, folk traditions. We still turn heads, and we are still subject to isolation and hate against those who follow a religion that preaches acceptance. This has a way of making us feel uncomfortable or unwanted in our own skin, one that we do belong in. And in today's age, I have to say, as one who has never felt in rhythm with the witchcraft community. This really is my first time stepping into an online space within witchcraft and putting myself out there. It's an amazing thing to have access to all these resources, these multitudes of traditions coming from other witches and practitioners and all sorts of backgrounds to better and strengthen us within magic as a whole. We're supporting each other more than ever and creating a library of what witchcraft truly is. At least to me, there's this collection of authentic practice that is personal and both shared across the board. There are little waves being turned into bigger ones, and it's exciting. Colleges are offering courses, even, and there are occult and esoteric studies. There are more and more events and festivals and online spaces, which is huge. I mean, huge. Well, sometimes that can be not such a great thing and, well, very problematic in today's society for many different reasons. But we won't get into that right now. It ultimately does witchcraft good, at least in my opinion. I guess, really, to wrap this up, within the community, wherever you fall, there is a war back against Christianity, just as it is against the witches themselves. And that's the part that's a little bit unfortunate because that's us reacting to a wound. And let's keep in mind that this is a witch podcast. So I will have my own views and opinions and beliefs, God forbid, and animosities against religious structuring, but I'm ultimately discussing these issues from the stance of a witch. I'm not here to tell you, Christianity ain't so bad and blah, 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 blah. I'm a witch. That's just plain and simple. Maybe it's stepping on a bit of toes, but if you find yourself in extreme disgust and maybe swearing religion and Christianity up and down, then it's time to look inward. The expression of hate towards this boils down to a wound. I think that it's something that we can all agree and recognize. It's natural for someone to want to hurt back the thing that hurts them or makes them feel like an outcast, especially if it's on TikTok or any other social media platform where it's really, really easy to rile up and get a whole lot of people to stand behind your statement and lash out on your behalf or even altogether without really understanding why. Anger causes blindness, extreme emotions can cause blindness, and as witches, yes, our practice is inherently emotion filled, and that is really a great thing. But it also needs to be logical, it needs to be methodical, and even skeptical too. I hope, this week's discussion doesn't scare too many people off. I will be talking about other things, I promise, but this is just another thing that I think was important to share, especially in the beginning of my journey when it comes to sharing with everyone else. and maybe you do still connect with it. And I think personally that's wonderful. And I appreciate all who have come to listen and hopefully will again. Until the next episode, thank you and have a wonderful day or night.